The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the leaves in the Belmont garden, where Lara played alone among the tall rose bushes and the scent of jasmine. The girl, with her bright, curious eyes, ran her fingers through the damp soil, pretending to plant secrets. That's when her fingernail hit something hard, metallic and cold. She dug a little more, uncovering a small silver locket with floral details and a miniature portrait of a woman with a sweet smile. Intrigued, Lara wiped the locket on the hem of her dress and opened it. Inside, besides the picture, there was a nearly faded inscription: "The truth blooms even beneath the earth." She repeated the words quietly, as if trying to understand what they meant. The breeze seemed to answer, rustling the leaves of the trees as if the garden had heard her. The girl ran toward the housekeeper, her mother, who was watching her from the porch, but she hesitated. Something about that object seemed to ask for silence. She turned her eyes back to the imposing mansion, with its closed windows and long shadows. The Belmont house had always given her a mix of fascination and fear, as if it held too many stories within its walls. As Lara slipped the locket into her pocket, she felt a shiver. Was it just a toy? Or maybe a memory left behind by someone who didn't want to be forgotten? Without knowing it, she had dug up not just an object, but the first thread of a secret that would change lives. Inside, a window opened slowly. A man watched from a distance, tall, serious, dressed in a dark suit. It was Eduardo Belmont, the owner of the house, who hadn't smiled in years. He saw the girl in the garden and for a moment thought he saw a ghost from the past, the same curiosity in her eyes that his late wife Isabel had when she was young. Do you believe that destiny can hide truths in the simplest of things? Then subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications, because Lara's story and the story of the boy Daniel is just beginning, and every minute will keep you on the edge of your seat. Upstairs, Daniel watched the garden from his bedroom window, seated in his wheelchair. He was 17, but with a frail body and the look of someone who had already lived through more than he could bear. When Lara came up the stairs, still holding the locket, his eyes lit up. It was rare for anyone besides his father and the nurses to visit him. Lara showed him the object, and Daniel went completely still. That face in the photo, that smile, was all too familiar. A distant memory shot through him like a beam of light cutting through the shadows in his mind. He whispered, almost without voice, "It's Mom." The word, long forgotten, made Lara's heart race. The nurses rushed in, startled by his reaction. Daniel was crying, and the tears fell slowly, finally releasing something his body had until then kept silent. Eduardo appeared in the doorway, stunned, unable to understand why his son was reacting this way to a simple locket.
That night, Eduardo tried to take the object from his son's hands, but Daniel refused. He only said one phrase before falling asleep: "She knew." Eduardo stood by the bed watching the boy. The sentence echoed in his mind like a riddle. Who knew? And what was there to know? Outside, the wind blew through the trees in the garden, carrying the same whisper that had accompanied the discovery. The truth blooms even beneath the earth. Eduardo didn't know it, but the earth had begun to unearth much more than memories. It was about to reveal the guilt he had spent years trying to forget. In the dim light of a luxurious office, the clock marked the passage of silence. Vanessa, elegant and cold as always, crossed her legs in front of Dr. Wallace. The doctor, his expression tense, typed something on his computer, avoiding looking directly at her. "He's starting to get suspicious," she said, without mincing words. The doctor took a deep breath and replied, "Eduardo has always been too clever for his own good, But as long as the boy depends on me, we have nothing to fear." Vanessa lit a cigarette, ignoring the office rules. The smoke rose slowly, drawing shapes in the air. "We have to make sure Daniel remains under control. He is the only living proof of what happened to Isabel." Wallace furrowed his brow. "And if he starts to remember?" She smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't talk." Meanwhile, Eduardo was reviewing the medical reports in his home office. Something was wrong. The dosage numbers changed inconsistently, and there were duplicate prescriptions. He called Vanessa for clarification, and she appeared with her usual reassuring tone, insisting that everything was under control. But her smooth voice hid poison. That night, Eduardo dreamed of Isabel. She appeared in the garden, dressed in white, with a desperate look in her eyes, asking for help. "They are silencing me, Eduardo," the vision said. He woke up sweating, his heart racing, and decided that if there was something to uncover, he would find it. In another part of the city, Vanessa stared out the window as the doctor locked away the files. "Don't worry, Wallace," she said with a faint smile. "As long as he's drowning in guilt, he will never see what's right in front of him." Eduardo began observing every detail of his son's routine. He noticed that the medication doses were always administered when Vanessa was present. Daniel, who had been listless before, seemed more alert when the nurse was late. A dangerous doubt was taking root in his mind. One morning, he asked to personally witness the medication change. Dr. Wallace seemed uncomfortable, but couldn't refuse. Eduardo watched everything, noting each substance name, each dosage, each reaction. His fatherly instinct was screaming. Something was deeply wrong. Vanessa, noticing his change in attitude, began acting more subtly. She started reminding him that Isabel had trusted them, and that doubting the doctors would be disrespectful to her memory. Eduardo, torn between reason and heart, began to question whether his guilt was making him see things that weren't there.
That night, in his office, he opened a drawer and found an old letter from Isabel. In it, she spoke of her concern about the experimental treatments Wallace was proposing. Eduardo closed his eyes, tormented by the idea that something terrible might have happened while he wasn't paying attention. Outside, Lara looked through the window and saw Daniel drawing a female figure surrounded by trees on a piece of paper. It was the same garden where it had all begun. Without anyone realizing it, the pieces were starting to fall into place, and the buried secret was beginning to bloom, slowly but surely. The soft sound of an old tape recording echoed through Daniel's room. A woman's voice sang a sweet, almost childlike melody about flowers and truths hidden beneath the earth. Lara, sitting beside him, held a small tape player she'd found in the attic. "She recorded this for you," the girl said. Daniel closed his eyes, and a silent tear rolled down his cheek. Eduardo walked into the room and stopped, surprised. The music hit him like a punch to the chest. It was Isabel's voice, alive, pure, unmistakable. He approached slowly, touching the tape player with a sense of reverence. "Where did you find this?" he asked. Lara told him about the attic and the rocket, and Eduardo realized that each object was a call from the past, begging to be heard. The song ended with an enigmatic phrase, "If the earth falls silent, look in the garden." Eduardo felt his blood run cold. It was the same phrase from the locket. The coincidence was impossible. He decided that the next day he would hire an investigator to reopen the case of Isabel's death, which had been closed for nearly 10 years. That night, Eduardo dreamed again. This time, Isabel was in the garden, kneeling and crying. "They poisoned me, Eduardo. They did it to Daniel, too."
The billionaire woke up disturbed, swearing to himself that he wouldn't rest until he understood everything. Meanwhile, Vanessa watched from a distance as the memories resurfaced. She knew that if Eduardo discovered what had been done, there would be no turning back. She smiled coldly, determined to act before the truth could fully come to light. The next morning, Eduardo discreetly hired a private investigator, a former police officer named Garrett. He asked him to review the medical charts and trace the origin of the substances used in Daniel's treatment. "I want the truth, whatever it costs," Eduardo said. Garrett, experienced and discreet, accepted without hesitation. Days later, the report arrived. Eduardo opened it with trembling hands. The substances listed weren't part of any official medical protocol. Some were even under investigation for causing temporary paralysis and dependency. Vanessa's name appeared on several purchase orders. Eduardo felt the ground disappear from under his feet. He went to the private hospital and confronted Dr. Wallace, who tried to justify the irregularities as administrative errors. But the doctor's unsettled look gave him away. He left without a word, certain now that Isabel had died for something far bigger than a sudden illness.
At home, Lara noticed her employer's change in mood. He had become quieter, more withdrawn. Daniel, in turn, had started having mild spasms, a sign that his body was reacting to the reduction in drugs. Eduardo decided to suspend part of the treatment, even against the doctor's advice. Outside, the wind rustled the trees in the garden, the same garden that had kept the secret for so long. And in that moment, Eduardo knew the truth was finally beginning to breathe. The housekeeper, Mrs. Helen, watched Eduardo from a distance, her heart heavy. She had served the family for over 20 years and knew more than she let on. One night, after her employer had retreated to his office, she knocked on the door carrying an old box. "Mrs. Isabel asked me to keep this, in case anything ever happened to her," she said, handing him the object, which was covered with a lace cloth. Inside the box were letters, photographs, and pages from Isabel's diary. The final pages were stained with tears and smudged ink. In one of them, Isabel described her growing fear of Vanessa, the woman who wanted to control everything, and mentioned Dr. Wallace, whose innovative treatments seemed to be worsening Daniel's health. Eduardo read every line with tear-filled eyes, feeling the weight of guilt for having ignored the signs. Helen revealed that days before she died, Isabel had argued with Vanessa about a project for the family's foundation. She had discovered something, the housekeeper said, but she didn't have time to tell me what it was. Eduardo clutched the diary to his chest, determined to follow the clues to the end. Meanwhile, Vanessa and the doctor were meeting in secret. Wallace was growing worried. "He's getting too close." Vanessa remained cold. "Then we need to be faster." There was something in her eyes, a mix of desperation and arrogance that grew as the truth drew nearer. In the early hours of the morning, Eduardo went out into the garden, the locket in one hand and the diary in the other. The wind whispered through the trees, and he felt as if he could hear Isabel's voice calling his name. For the first time in years, he answered out loud, "I'm not running away anymore." Garrett returned with new information. He had found documents proving that Vanessa and Dr. Wallace had been siphoning money from the Isabel Belmont Foundation to fund illegal research at private clinics. Worse yet, Daniel had been listed as an experimental patient without his father's consent. Eduardo felt sick to his stomach. "They turned my son into a living laboratory." As he read the dossier, each sentence felt like a blow. The report included emails, bank records, and even images of shipments of adulterated medication. Vanessa's betrayal, from someone he had considered a friend and advisor, was the cruelest blow of all. Eduardo clenched his fists, vowing to himself that he would not let history repeat itself. Lara, curious, saw her employer crying alone in his office. She approached him and said gently, "The truth hurts, but it also sets you free." Eduardo looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, he managed a faint smile. "You're right, Lara. Isabel would be proud of you."
Meanwhile, Vanessa could feel the net closing in. She tried to bribe Garrett, but he refused, and then mysteriously disappeared that very night. Growing suspicious, Eduardo ordered that Vanessa be discreetly followed. They discovered she was planning to flee the country with fake documents and a secret bank account. When confronted, Vanessa denied everything with a dramatic performance, feigning outrage. "You're sick with guilt, Eduardo," she shouted, but his gaze was steely. "No, Vanessa. The one who is sick is the person who thinks they can play God." And with that, the battle for the truth began to take shape, a war where love and justice would be tested to their limits. The following days were filled with constant tension. Eduardo pretended everything was normal, but every glance at Vanessa was a reminder of the poison she had spread through his home. She, in turn, maintained a cynical smile, trying to turn the situation to her advantage. "Eduardo," she would say in a sweet voice, "Isabel wasn't who you think she was. She was hiding secrets you couldn't bear to hear." The insinuation cut through Eduardo like a blade. Vanessa told a fabricated story about Isabel having had an affair, attempting to twist his memories and manipulate his grief. For a moment he doubted, until he remembered the letters and the recorded song, testaments to Isabel's purity and love. Vanessa's lie sounded desperate, like the last resort of someone cornered. Meanwhile, Lara and Daniel worked together in secret. He would draw his mother's face, and Lara would help him remember the details. "She used to talk about the garden," Daniel said, "and she told me the wind carried secrets." With every conversation, fragments of memory returned, revealing moments he hadn't recalled since childhood. Eduardo had the investigator review the security footage from the mansion from the time just before Isabel's death. That's when they noticed a female figure entering her room on the night of the tragedy. It was Vanessa. Eduardo felt his body tremble. The past no longer left any room for doubt. That night, Eduardo watched Vanessa descend the staircase, surrounded by luxury and falsehood. He swore to himself it would be the last day she ever set foot in his house. The truth was about to emerge, and this time he would not allow it to be buried again. Lara was spending the afternoon organizing the old library, a forgotten room full of dust and memories. As she moved a heavy bookcase, she heard something fall behind it. A small hidden compartment had opened in the wall, revealing an old varnished wooden box with the name Isabel engraved in gold letters. Lara felt a shiver. With trembling hands, she opened the lid and found several cassette tapes inside, along with a yellowed note. "If they silence me, my voice will still find the wind." Her curiosity piqued and her heart racing, she took the tapes to her room. She used the old tape player Daniel had fixed weeks before. When she pressed play, the tape hiss gave way to a soft, familiar voice. "Eduardo, if you are hearing this, it means you have discovered what they did to us." Lara froze. It was Isabel Belmont, the woman whose death had changed everything. On the recording, Isabel explained that she had been feeling sick for months and that Dr. Wallace kept insisting on experimental treatments approved by Vanessa. Her voice was growing weaker, but her words carried a devastating force. "They say they want to cure me, but I can feel the poison burning inside. I'm afraid for Daniel. He's becoming the next target." The sound of a knock at the door interrupted the recording, followed by a muffled scream. Lara felt a lump form in her throat. This wasn't just a memory, it was an accusation. She ran to Eduardo's office and placed the tape recorder on his desk. "You need to hear this," she said, breathless. The billionaire looked at the device with hesitation, but upon hearing his wife's voice, he broke down. Silent tears fell as he listened to the confession he had always feared existed. "They poisoned me, Eduardo, and if anything happens to me, protect our son." The tape ended with the sound of hurried footsteps in breaking glass. Eduardo was paralyzed, unsure whether to scream or cry. This was the definitive proof. "My God, Isabel tried to warn me." As Eduardo was recovering from the shock, Vanessa, who was passing by in the hallway, overheard part of the conversation. Her face went pale. She rushed to Daniel's room, trying to disguise her haste. "Daniel, sweetheart, are you all right?" she asked with false sweetness, probing to see if he also knew about the tape. His firm, silent gaze was answer enough. That night, Lara hid the tape recorder in her backpack, fearing something might happen. But Vanessa, driven by panic, broke into the girl's room while everyone was sleeping. She tried to snatch the device from her hands, and the two struggled. The recorder fell to the floor and cracked, a single ribbon of tape spilling out and fluttering in the air. Lara screamed, and the security guards came running. Eduardo was the first to arrive, shoving Vanessa against the wall. "Enough! I heard everything," he roared, his eyes brimming with anger and pain. Vanessa tried to dissemble, but her mask had slipped. "You don't understand, Eduardo. She was going to ruin everything," she shouted. But her words had lost their power. Security guards escorted her from the mansion as Eduardo watched the garden from the window. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and he heard, or imagined he heard, Isabella's voice saying, "You found the way, my love." For the first time in years, Eduardo felt his heart beat with purpose. But there was still justice to be served, and he wouldn't rest until he saw it done. The following dawn brought a heavy silence. Eduardo remained for hours in front of Isabel's portrait, holding the locket between his fingers. The past now had a name, a voice, and proof. He gathered all the tapes, Garrett's reports, and Isabel's diary into a black folder. Daybreak arrived with the sound of his car engine. He was going to the police, determined to put to rest the ghosts that had haunted him for a decade. When he arrived at the police station, the billionaire was met with skepticism. Few believed that a renowned doctor and an influential woman were capable of such brutal crimes. But when Eduardo presented the recordings and the documents, the detective fell silent. The voices of Isabel and the bank records said it all. "Prepare the warrants," the officer ordered, his expression grim.
When the sentence was read, silence fell over the courtroom. Convicted of homicide, fraud, and medical abuse, Vanessa and Wallace were led away in handcuffs. Eduardo didn't celebrate. There was no glory in justice that came too late. He simply stood up, looked at the judge, and said, "Thank you for giving a voice back to those who were silenced." Then he walked out without looking back. Outside, the world seemed to carry on as normal, but inside, everything had changed for him. The press was waiting with microphones and cameras, but Eduardo declined all interviews. "Pain is not a spectacle," he replied, walking to his car. That phrase would be repeated in headlines the next day, symbolizing the end of an era of silence. Meanwhile, Daniel was facing a new kind of battle. In the hospital, his body was reacting unpredictably to the withdrawal from the drugs. Seizures, fevers, and pain left him exhausted. Eduardo spent nights at his bedside, holding his hand, fearing that the price of justice might come in the form of loss. "Hang in there, son," he whispered between quiet prayers. During one of those early mornings, Daniel went into collapse. Alarms blared, nurses came running, and Eduardo watched, powerless, as his son's life hung by a thread. He felt himself on his knees before God and fate, begging, "I've lost too much already. Let me keep him." Time seemed to stop. After hours of tension, the lead doctor emerged from the room with a tired expression. "He's strong, Mr. Belmont. He's going to pull through." Eduardo broke down crying, hugging Lara and Helen, who had stayed at the hospital the entire time. The housekeeper cried as if he were her own grandson. In the days that followed, Daniel remained unconscious, but his face was serene. Eduardo spoke to him every day, reminiscing about childhood stories and the dreams Isabel had for his future. "She believed you would build bridges. And look at that, son. That's exactly what you're doing, bridging the past and tomorrow." When he finally opened his eyes, Daniel looked at his father and whispered weakly, "Dad, I'm still here." Eduardo cried again, but this time from relief. The hell was over. Justice had been served. But above all, hope had survived. The morning sun streamed through the hospital room window and fell across Daniel's face. For the first time in many years, the light in the young man's eyes wasn't from pain, but from life. And Eduardo, weary, realized Isabel had won. The following months brought a new rhythm to the Belmont mansion. The silence of the hallways was replaced with voices, laughter, and the sound of careful footsteps from nurses and architects. Daniel was coming home, not as the sick boy from before, but as a man reborn, determined to transform his suffering into creation. His rehabilitation process was slow. Every movement, every attempt to stand required superhuman effort. But Daniel never gave up. "My mother used to say that the body obeys the soul when it has a purpose," he told Lara during his physical therapy sessions. She helped him with patience, encouraging every small victory.
Eduardo watched it all closely, always in silence, like a deeply moved observer. Sometimes he would see his son push himself to the limit and feel the urge to intervene, but he knew this was a battle Daniel needed to win on his own. "I can't walk for him," he thought, "but I can clear every path for him." One afternoon, Daniel asked to be taken to the garden, the very same one where the locket had been found. The sun cast a golden glow on the leaves, and the air carried the scent of the flowers Isabel had loved so much. He looked around and smiled. "This is where it all began, and it's where I want to begin again." Lara held his hand, and for a moment, time itself seemed to bend under the weight of that powerful moment. Inspired, Daniel started drawing again. His first designs were simple, but full of emotion. With Lara's help, he created the blueprint for the new Isabel Belmont Foundation building, a center dedicated to rehabilitation and support for victims of medical negligence. When Eduardo saw the drawings, he was deeply moved. "This is more than architecture, son. This is redemption given form in concrete." As the months passed, the project took shape. Daniel supervised the construction personally, even from his wheelchair, and every new wall that went up seemed to heal an old wound. Lara, now an architecture student, had become his inseparable partner in both work and life. Together, they weren't just designing buildings, they were designing futures. Eduardo, in turn, dedicated himself to transforming the foundation into a living legacy. He brought together honest doctors, therapists, and volunteers. "This is our way of making justice last," he would say. The mansion became a home again, and laughter once more echoed through hallways that had long been dominated by silence. One evening, Daniel found his father in the study,
contemplating the portrait of Isabel. "You know that she wouldn't have wanted you to remain trapped in the past. I think, in some way, she already knew we would win. Not with revenge, but with love." Eduardo hugged him, unable to hold back his tears. On the day the foundation's building was completed, the flowers in the garden seemed more vibrant than ever. Daniel looked at the finished structure and said, "She's in every brick, Dad, and in every smile that will be born here." Eduardo nodded, looking up at the sky, and replied, "And now, finally, so are we." The Belmont family was reborn from the ashes, not as the same people they were before, but as versions of themselves rebuilt by pain, by truth, and by faith in what could still flourish. And in the background, the wind moving through the garden seemed to carry a soft whisper, "You kept your promise, Eduardo." The dawn of that day felt different. The sky was painted in shades of gold and blue, and the wind carried the scent of the newly planted flowers in the foundation's garden. Eduardo, dressed simply, watched the final preparations for the new building's inauguration from a distance. It was the same land where Isabel had once dreamed of building something great. Now, her dream was finally taking shape. In the packed auditorium, people from all walks of life had gathered. Victims of medical errors, journalists, old friends, and public officials. Daniel, in his wheelchair, was at the center of the stage, alongside Lara and his father. The light in his eyes was different now, not that of someone who had won a war, but of someone who had learned to transform pain into purpose.
Eduardo stepped up to the podium. His voice trembled slightly, but his words carried the weight of a lifetime. "For years, I lived surrounded by silence and guilt. Today, I realize that justice doesn't erase the pain, but it can transform tragedy into hope. This foundation is Isabel's forgiveness, and ours too." The audience rose in a moving, heartfelt applause. Daniel spoke next. He spoke with serenity and emotion, revealing that the new center would be named the Garden of Truth, in honor of his mother and the place where the secret was first revealed. "Here, every patient will find more than just treatment. They will find a new beginning, just like I did." His voice caught with emotion, and the audience cried with him. Vanessa and Dr. Wallace, imprisoned in a federal penitentiary, watched the news on a small cell television. The empty look in Vanessa's eyes reflected both regret and bitterness, two ghosts that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Wallace just murmured, "He built something from what we destroyed." The irony of justice was silent but relentless. After the ceremony, Eduardo walked through the hallways of the new building. Every white wall, every architectural detail bore his son's signature style. "It's beautiful, Daniel," he said, his eyes filled with tears. The young man replied with a calm smile. "She would be proud, Dad. Mom always wanted people's pain to have a place where it could blossom." Lara, standing beside them, held a bouquet of white lilies. They were the same type of flower Isabel used to have at her philanthropic events. She placed the bouquet in front of the statue, symbolizing the institution's founder, a sculpture based on one of Daniel's paintings. "Now, Isabel is in every act of love that will be born here," she said. The sun began to set, painting the sky orange. Its light streamed through the auditorium's stained glass windows, forming patterns of wings and flowers. Eduardo looked upward and felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to keep loving in spite of everything. That evening, the Belmont mansion felt like a home again. Helen prepared a simple dinner, filled with laughter. Lara and Daniel exchanged looks that blended tenderness and deep understanding. Eduardo watched them in silence, his heart feeling light. Finally, the cycle of pain was coming to an end. Before going to sleep, he walked into the garden and looked at the locket now hanging from a tree branch. The moonlight made it shine like a star. "You won, Isabel," he whispered. The wind blew through the flowers, and he swore he could hear a soft voice reply, "No, Eduardo, we won." Years passed. The Garden of Truth grew into an international benchmark for ethical medical rehabilitation and research. The Belmont name, once associated with tragedy, now symbolized courage, faith, and rebirth. The past still carried an ache, but it had been transformed into fuel for the future.
Daniel, now 28, was an award-winning architect. Though he had never fully regained the use of his legs, he had become an inspiration to young people around the world. "My limitations taught me how to build freedom," he would say in his lectures. Lara, by his side, managed the foundation, turning every project into a silent tribute to love and truth. Eduardo, older but serene, spent his mornings in the garden. He enjoyed watching the flowers and listening to the sound of the birds. Sometimes he would see Daniel and Lara working together and feel his heart grow warm. The guilt had finally dissolved, replaced by gratitude. Maybe this was the plan all along, he would think. Pain shakes us, but love rebuilds us. One afternoon, Daniel showed his father a new project, a pediatric wing for the rehabilitation center. "I want children to understand that the truth isn't the end, it's the beginning of something greater," he said, his eyes shining. Eduardo smiled with pride. "You turned suffering into art, son. That's what your mother always wanted." During the Foundation's anniversary celebration, a symbolic ceremony was held. Eduardo gave a brief speech, passing the leadership torch to Daniel and Lara. "From today onward, the legacy belongs to you. Isabel would trust it in your hands." The audience gave a standing ovation, and the old businessman shed quiet tears, tears of peace. That night, while walking in the garden, Daniel looked up at the starry sky. "You know, Lara, sometimes I feel like she's still here," he said. "Maybe she always has been," she replied. And the silence between them was more eloquent than any words. There was love there, pure, matured, and true. But among the new patients at the Foundation, one case stood out. A young man named Ethan had arrived in a wheelchair, with symptoms identical to those Daniel had experienced in childhood. "This can't be," Daniel murmured as he read the medical file. The substances listed were the same ones Wallace had used years before. Daniel's heart raced. He called Lara and Eduardo into his office. "If this is true, then someone is still continuing the experiments." Eduardo looked at him surprised. "You think that—" Daniel interrupted. "I don't think, Dad. I know. And if the past wants to resurface, we'll face it together." The sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Daniel looked out the window at the garden, the same one where it had all begun, and felt a familiar strength surge through him. The truth always finds a way to bloom, no matter how many times they try to bury it. And in that new dawn, with the wind gently brushing the flowers and the memory of Isabel alive in every corner, the Belmont story began anew. Not as a tragedy, but as an eternal legacy of courage, forgiveness, and love. Not all healing comes from doctors, and not every victory is about winning. Sometimes it's about beginning again. If this story touched you, subscribe now and stay with us, because here every story reminds the heart of what truly matters, the power of truth and love.